All right, ready to dive deep into flood preparedness.
Always.
This time, we're zeroing in on how people in Tokyo's Sumida ward are thinking about floods.
Oh, interesting.
We're looking at a study from the Journal of Asian Architecture and Building Engineering.
And it gets into some pretty cool stuff. Like, this study doesn't just look at the physical flood risks,
It goes deeper.
way deeper. It goes into, like, the psychology of evacuation decisions.
Like what makes someone decide to leave or stay.
Exactly. And what kind of information people want, during a flood.
So it's about more than just sirens and maps.
Totally. It's about understanding how people actually react when
Yep.
things get serious.
Because even with the best flood walls in the world, it comes down to human behavior, right?
100%. So, to set the scene, Sumida Ward is really vulnerable to flooding. Like, incredibly vulnerable.
How vulnerable are we talking?
Think maximum elevation of only 4 meters above sea level.
Whoa, that's not a lot.
Not at all. And some areas are even below sea level. Plus, it's surrounded by rivers like the Arakawa.
I know the Arakawa.
And the Sumigawa, right?
You got it. And the Yokojikan, too.
So basically, a recipe for trouble if there's ever heavy rain.
Yeah, and especially with the population growing, it just makes things even more risky.
More people in a smaller space, higher stakes.
Exactly. They've already had 7 inland flooding events just between 2003 and 2014.
Wow, so this isn't theoretical, this is a real threat.
Oh, absolutely real. This study surveyed residents, get this, from 8 to 88 years old.
With a huge age range.
Huge. And one of the biggest things they found was how important family is when deciding to evacuate.
Makes sense, right? When there's danger, you want your family close.
It's like built in. Almost 92% of people said that within 30 minutes of a flood warning, their top priority would be gathering their family.
Wow, that's powerful. So it's like a primal instinct, almost.
Totally. The study calls it gather tendency.
Gather tendency. Interesting. Did they look at whether that tendency was different for different age groups? They did. And it turns out older residents were actually more likely to prioritize gathering family over evacuating right away, compared to younger folks at least.
Really? That's something to think about. I wonder why that is.
I know, right? Maybe it has to do with a greater sense of responsibility for kids or elderly parents.
Yeah, maybe. It definitely raises some questions about how we communicate about evacuations, though.
Totally. Like, maybe messages aimed at older residents should really emphasize having a plan in place with family.
So you can get everyone together quickly and then evacuate as a unit.
Exactly. It could save precious time.
It makes you wonder, too, if for younger folks, maybe just grab what you need and go message might be more effective.
Oh, that's an interesting thought. So different messages for different groups.
Right. Because clearly there's not a one-size-fits-all approach here.
No, not at all. Another fascinating thing the study found was this link between knowing about local shelters and just knowing more about floods in general.
So it's like if you're familiar with the shelters, you're just more aware of the whole flood thing.
That's what it seems like. People who spent time around shelters, they knew more about the risks. And they knew what to pack in a go bag and what to do in an emergency. It's almost like proximity to those resources made them learn more, even passively.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. Makes you think, are there ways we could, like, proactively incorporate flood education into more spaces?
Ooh, like what?
Well, beyond shelters, I mean. Like, what about libraries? Or community centers? Even schools?
Yeah. If just being around shelters has an effect, imagine what we could do if we were more intentional about it.
Right. Like, if we wove flood awareness into the fabric of daily life, especially in flood-prone areas.
What's a really cool idea? We should explore that more later.
Definitely. But for now, let's circle back to this gather tendency for a sec. Did the study look at how family size plays into it at all?
Oh, yeah. And this part is really interesting. They found that in households with fewer than 4 people, the actual number of people could predict the gather tendency.
Wait, so smaller families were more likely to gather before evacuating?
That's what the study found, yeah.
Interesting. Any idea why that might be?
Well, they think it might be because in smaller families, there's a stronger sense of needing to stick together.
Makes sense. Like fewer logistical hurdles, maybe?
Maybe. And maybe a stronger sense of responsibility for each other since there are fewer people to share it with.
Yeah, I can see that. So it's not just a universal family first thing, it's more nuanced than that.
Way more nuanced. It's influenced by age, by family size, and probably even by things we haven't thought of yet.
And that's important to remember when we're designing those flood maps and communication systems, right?
Huge. We need to take all those nuances into account.
Totally. Speaking of information, did the study ask people what kind of information they really wanted during a flood?
They did. And real-time information was at the top of the list.
Okay, what kind of real-time information?
People wanted updates on three main things: the safety of their family members, the status of things like electricity and water, and any damage reports specific to their area.
So hyper-local info?
Hyperlocal. Like, it wasn't enough to know that flooding was happening generally in the area. They wanted to know if their street, their block was affected.
Makes sense. That's the information that would directly impact their decisions, right?
Yeah,
Especially about their loved ones.
exactly. And the study found that people who knew more about floods were even more likely to want that granular real-time data.
So the more they knew, the more they wanted to know.
It seems that way. Like, their knowledge fueled a desire for even more specific information.
Makes you think that if we could somehow give everyone that level of detailed information in real time, it could really increase preparedness across the board.
Oh, for sure. The question is, how do we actually get that information to people quickly and effectively, especially during the chaos of a flood?
Yeah, good point. Any ideas? Did the study look at that at all?
They did. And this is where the role of official communication channels gets really interesting.
Ooh, you mean like calls from city officials, firefighters, police, those kinds of things?
Exactly. And the study found that a call from one of those figures was a huge motivator for people to evacuate.
Even more so than just feeling like they were in danger.
It seems that way.
Def-
Even if someone felt relatively safe at home, a call from, say, a firefighter saying it's time to go could be the deciding factor.
Wow. It's like those official voices carry a lot of weight.
They really do.
Yeah.
People trust them. And it gets even more fascinating when you think about how this connects with the importance of family in evacuation decisions.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. How do those two things connect?
Well, if we know that people are highly motivated by official calls to evacuate, and we know that their top priority is gathering their families.
Then why not use those official channels to emphasize family preparedness?
Exactly. Like, what if those calls also said something like, make sure you have a plan to gather your loved ones and get to safety quickly?
Almost like a don't wait until it's too late kind of message.
Precisely. By tapping into those emotional drivers, those instincts to protect our families, we can make those warnings even more impactful.
I like it. It's a smart way to combine what we know about human behavior with those official channels.
It's all about crafting a message that resonates on both a logical level and an emotional level.
Makes sense. But even with the best messages, how do we get people to actually internalize that information and act on it?
Well, that's where this concept of self-awareness comes in.
Self-awareness. How does that play into flood preparedness?
It's all about encouraging people to, like, mentally walk through what they would do in a flood, to visualize themselves making decisions and taking action.
So not just passively knowing the information, but actually picturing themselves doing it.
Exactly. And the study actually found some pretty compelling evidence that this kind of self-awareness could significantly enhance preparedness.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more about this self-awareness thing.
Let's save that for part 2 of our deep dive.
All right, I can't wait.
Welcome back. We were talking about self-awareness and how important it is for flood preparedness.
Right. You mentioned the study found that self-awareness could make people more prepared. But how did they measure that?
It's pretty cool, actually. They had these hypothetical flood scenarios and asked people how they'd respond.
So it's not just about knowing the right answer, it's about being able to like see yourself in that situation.
Totally. Thinking through what you do, what problems might come up, all that.
So it's not just I should evacuate, it's I can actually see myself evacuating.
Exactly. And what they found was people who knew more about floods, they also tended to show more self-awareness during these pretend evacuations.
Oh, interesting. So knowledge equals awareness.
Kind of. They were better at explaining their decisions. They thought about obstacles, things like having a communication plan with family or a go bag ready to go, stuff like that.
It's like knowing more about floods gave them a framework for actually dealing with one, not just knowing about it in theory.
I like that, like having a mental map, not just of the physical streets and stuff, but of the whole experience.
Right. The emotions, the logistics, all of it. Did they see any connection between this self-awareness and that gather tendency we talked about?
That's a great question. They didn't directly connect those two things, but they did look at self-awareness in different situations.
Including ones with family?
Yeah, including those.
Okay, what'd they find?
The highest self-awareness was when people were evacuating with family members who needed help. You know, kids, older relatives.
That makes sense. When you're responsible for someone, you're probably going to be more aware of every single thing you do.
Right. Every decision, every step you take. Like, That responsibility really amps up the self-awareness,
Right.
makes them think through all the what-ifs.
So that instinct to protect your loved ones, it might drive that gather tendency, but then it also leads to being super self-aware during the actual evacuation.
Yeah, it's this cool mix of instincts and thinking things through.
So we're seeing a pretty complex picture of how people in Sumida Ward think about floods. It's not just fear, it's family, knowledge, self-awareness, trusting those official warnings.
It all ties together. It's
Yep.
all about wanting to be safe, for ourselves and the people we care about.
I'm starting to think if we know so much about how people act during floods, we could design even better ways to help them prepare.
Absolutely. And that's what the researchers are saying too. They think if we include these ideas about gathered tendency and self-awareness in flood maps and communication,
Mm.
we could really make a difference.
Okay, how? What would that look like?
Well, imagine a flood map that not only shows evacuation routes, but also asks you to think about gathering your family.
Okay, I'm listening.
Like, where would you meet? How long would it take to get there? What if someone has trouble moving around?
So you're building those gather tendency questions right into the map.
Yeah. It's not just giving information, it's making you use it, personally,
Yeah.
to picture yourself and your family in that situation.
Like a mental rehearsal tool
Yeah.
to practice those decisions before a flood actually happens.
Exactly. And think about the self-awareness part. What if the map gave you different flood scenarios and you had to think through how you'd react?
Almost like a game, but with real life consequences.
Right. Make it interactive, make it engaging, and people might actually bridge that gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it.
I love that. Instead of just facts, it's about making it an experience, putting people right at the center of it.
Yes. It's about making flood preparedness less abstract, more about relatable stuff.
This is fascinating. I'm already thinking about how this could work for other disasters too, not just floods.
Oh, for sure. These ideas apply to anything. Wildfires, earthquakes, you name it. The human factor is always a huge part of it.
Totally. I feel way more informed and even a little more prepared after this deep dive. How about you?
Me too. But hold on, there's one more thing from this study I think we should talk about.
Oh, what's that?
It has to do with how people see risk and how that affects whether they'll actually take action during a flood.
Okay, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of human behavior.
We are. And this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, you were saying something about how people see risk, and how that affects what they do during a flood.
Right, right. So the study, it found that people who had actually lived through a flood were way more likely to see flood risk as like a real danger, a serious thing.
Makes sense. If you've seen the damage firsthand, you take it more seriously than someone who hasn't.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
totally different hearing about it versus actually seeing the impact, like seeing it with your own eyes,
Yeah.
or even knowing someone who's been through it.
Right, like it hits closer to home. Did the study, did it look at whether those people were also more prepared? Like, did they have a plan or a go bag ready?
Oh, yeah, they did. And those who'd experienced flooding or knew someone who had, they were way more likely to have actually, prepared for a future flood.
So they took that experience and turned it into action.
Exactly. They weren't messing around.
I guess that makes sense. But the question is, how do we reach the people who haven't had that experience?
That's the tricky part.
How do we make them feel that same sense of urgency?
And that's where I think those ideas we were talking about, the self-awareness and the other tendency stuff, that could really help.
Okay, yeah, remind me how.
Well, if we get people to actually picture themselves, going through an evacuation, gathering their families, making tough decisions, it might create a more, I don't know, a more real understanding of the risk.
Even without having lived through it themselves.
Right. Like we're giving them a taste of the real thing.
A virtual experience, kind of.
Exactly. And we can use those instincts, those feelings about protecting our families, and use them to make people want to be prepared.
So it's not just about giving them the facts, it's about making them feel it.
Yeah, it's got to be personal,
Yeah.
And when we bring in that gather tendency, getting people to think about how they'd actually gather their families during a flood, it could help prevent problems before they even happen.
It's like a practice run, but for a disaster.
I like that. We're not just waiting for something bad to happen, we're getting ahead of it.
Being proactive, not reactive.
Exactly.
Mm.
And, this whole conversation, it's really shown me the power of storytelling when it comes to risk.
Oh, interesting. How so?
It's not just about the numbers,
Yeah.
It's about connecting with people, sharing experiences, and helping them see themselves in those situations.
You're right. Stories make it real. And what if we could get people to tell their own stories about floods?
Oh, I love that. Like a community storytelling project all about flood experiences.
Yeah, good and bad, survival stories, lessons learned.
It would be powerful. People could learn from each other, and it might inspire them to get prepared themselves.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an amazing deep dive. We've covered so much from the technical stuff to the human side of things. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of what it means to be prepared for a flood.
Me too. And I hope our listeners, they feel like they can actually do something to talk to their families, check out those interactive maps, and really become advocates for a safer future.
Absolutely. A huge thank you to our expert for being here and sharing all this incredible knowledge. And to our listeners, we challenge you to think about your own flood plan.
Have you talked to your family about what you do? Got those supplies ready?
Have you taken a minute to really picture yourselves going through it?
These questions, they can really make a difference. Because as this research shows, preparedness is not just about knowing, it's about doing.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into flood preparedness. We hope it's got you thinking and maybe even feeling a little more ready for whatever comes your way. Stay curious and stay safe.